yeah, give me on the chat information if you can hear me well. Thank you you're also for that. Jason Little from Canada, a great agile thinker and author of Lean Change Management book. Today, the topic of our talk is Rethinking Agile Transformation. And Jason, if you can say a few words about you and introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks for having me. So, can everyone hear me okay? Is the audio okay? Okay. Yep, good. All right. So, I started my career as a developer in the 90s. So, I'm the world's greatest cold fusion developer, probably the only one too. And I got into project management in the late 90s, and then the early 2000s started practicing Agile, I guess. So I fell into it a bit backwards. So the company I was working with, we were just using some of the practices without knowing what they were at the time. So that would have been around the time the manifesto was created, and then the mid 2000s, I discovered Agile and then started helping organizations with various different practices. So I've been a product owner on a team, I've been a Scrum Master, been a kind of sort of tester, internal coach, external coach, and worked with all sorts of companies from 20-person companies up to 80,000 plus enterprises, and in all industries. So in healthcare, in banking, in media, and various different little pockets and things like that. So what really got me started down this path was really at one of the large organizations I was working for, just ran into an organizational brick wall. So the senior manager and director had pulled me in their office, and I was the Scrum Master at the time, and they said, well, we want to run this project as an Agile project, but we don't want Agile to get in the way. So I went back to them and said, well, there's only 4 values. Which ones of those do you want me to break? Which was just a horrible, horrible way to answer that question. But back then, I really had nothing else other than Agile. So some of you might have heard the term of hitting people over the head with the Agile stick. That's not Agile enough. Be more Agile type of thing. And that's sort of what my stance was about 10 years ago until that event happened. And then I got started exploring the world of organizational change. So I took me a few years, and then I realized that the director and the senior manager were really saying, if the project falls off the rails, they're the ones that are going to get yelled at. So they don't want to get yelled at. So instead of trying to help them and advocate for them, I got kind of a little cagey and defensive. So out how to bridge practices between the organizational change community and the Agile community and the change management community, and bringing in some elements of customer development and design thinking and lean startup. And usually what I find is there's lots of really good ideas from all these different communities, but we tend to be a little bit insular sometimes and think that it's just HR's responsibility to transform, or it's just the change managers, or it's just the Agile people. But if we start to combine the best of our practices together, then we're more likely to make things work in our organizations. I guess the main idea behind it is that there's a difference in perception between what the consultants or coaches who are external are doing and what their perception of the changes versus people who are employees in the organization. So we know change and deep transformation takes a long time, but as external coaches and consultants, sometimes we think it should be following our timetable when it's not really the case, because we don't have to live with those consequences. So most of what I write and talk about is about how do we avoid some of those pitfalls given the decades of data that we have from Agile and change.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
yeah.
So so it was great introduction, and as you can hear, we definitely will have some very inspiring talk from Jason. Actually, my initial idea was to invite Jason to be our keynote speaker at the IT Manager of Tomorrow conference in Vilnius in June. Unfortunately, and luckily for Jason, he decided to take some time off from traveling, and good for you, actually. Nice idea. But anyway, I hope we'll have a chance to invite you someday, sometime to Poland to be part of our event. We will have like 45 up to 60 minutes for this webinar, and Jason will start with a talk and some slides. After that, we will have a Q&A session. We decided to invite you to ask the questions on the chat, so please feel free to ask the question whenever you want, and I will try to list them all, and we'll use it during the Q&A session at the end. Before Jason starts, we prepared a survey for you. So just to gather some kind of information about our audience, we prepared the 3 questions for you to understand how familiar you are with the topic of change management. And there are 3 questions. So have you ever been involved in any organizational change or transformation? Is it Agile or any other? Or have you ever been driven any transformation? And the third question is, have you read a book written by Jason, a little Lean Change Management? So do you see the questions? Let me know.
Cool. Yeah, people are responding.
Yeah, people responding. And do we see the...
I don't see the results. I just see the, oh, because I probably have to respond first, I guess, before I see it.
One moment, don't know why I can't see the results. Usually it was easier. I mean, there was a... I'm looking for the, to switch to the results. Thank you, people, for answering the questions. Don't know why. Okay, let's continue, and I will try to figure out. I don't know where is the button to show the results, so we'll use it later. Okay, so I'm handing the control over to Jason, and Jason, please start your presentation.
Alrighty. Okay, cool. So our brains have this desire for certainty, so we tend to sometimes see change as happening in a linear and plan-driven way. So we plan the change, and we execute the change, and we close it down. Very much project thinking. People who like Lean or Kanban tend to like the idea of current state, transition, future state. So let's just define the future state and define the gaps of what's different and what we need to do, and make a plan to get there, and then we'll get there. Very kind of linear, logical, very Spock-like, if you will. And especially in big organizations, somebody has to pay for the change team or the consultants or the coaches, so they do need to run some type of project, but it doesn't really follow sort of that timetable the way that we think does. And the Agile and the change camps tend to have their own view of why change doesn't work. So on the Agile side, we tend to go more in what I like to call the fluffy stuff, and I've been called the fluffy Agile guy too. So we get into the debates around we're not being Agile, we're just doing Agile, or leadership isn't Agile enough, or we're not teal enough, whatever that is. But it tends to be a little more on the art side of change, and things that are a little more abstract and more values principles based. But on the change side, in the change management world, they tend to go more towards logic and facts. I'll put facts in air quotes because the 70% of changes fail stat that gets marketed in the change world, it's nonsense. It doesn't mean anything, and it's not true for starters. The actual stat is about 30% of the time we accurately guess to 100% what our return on investment will be. And then about 55 or 56% of the time, it kind of works, but it wasn't exactly what we had thought, and it only outright fails about 18% of the time. But that is something that the change world sells or uses to try and sell, standards and certifications and tools and things like that. And there's plenty of other folks. If you look up these names, Jen Fram, Heather Stagel, Niles Flaging, who talks a lot about this, and Paul Gibbons, and many of those folks and myself have gone through those studies and sort of debunked a little bit of them. But they'll tend to say things like that we change fails because we don't have a standard method. People are unpredictable. There's no burning platform, or people resist change. So it's all of these reasons on both sides are more about externalizing the blame. So it can't possibly be me as the change person. I'm totally awesome, and it's like all y'all that didn't, work on the change. So it's everybody else's fault except for mine, and that doesn't really help anything, especially when you're coming in as an external. Think of talking to a CEO in an organization and say, now see here, 70% of the time changes fail. How is that going to be helpful? So we want to kind of move away from that project management and abstract kind of thinking and the externalizing of the blame, and really sort of look at why change, how change actually happens. So first, let's take a look at the last almost 10 years of data from version 1. So for people who don't know, there is something called the State of Agile Development Survey by version 1. I'm typing that in the chat. And version 1 is a US-based company that does this survey every year, and they ask companies why they're choosing Agile, where they're getting stuck, what practices are they using, what benefits are they getting, etc. And the reasons for choosing Agile have been basically the same for the last 10 years. So that we want to be able to manage our changing priorities and accelerate time to market are always the top two. But generally speaking, the reasons are always the same. So at least there is some type of purpose behind it. I would argue in the area where I live, Agile's more or less just become fashionable. So especially, it's mostly telecom, banking, and insurance in the Toronto area. So they're very much late adopters, and they're just doing it because it's kind of the barrier to entry now. It's table stakes. Everybody has to do some form of Agile because everybody else is doing it. So there really isn't a strong, compelling, purposeful reason. It's just we need to start doing that because. So when we look at the barriers, where are companies getting stuck? Those are the same as well. And these problems aren't really Agile problems. These have always been organizational change problems and political fights in organizations and things like that. But really, failure to change culture, my personal favorite, resistance to change, which is basically just blaming everybody else, and support. These have been constant ever since version 1 started doing this survey. So it's interesting that, if you look at how Agile has evolved, so anybody who has been involved in Agile since the early 2000s, you can see all the different methods and tools that have been quote unquote invented over the last 15 years. And none of them are really new. Even the stuff I write about, it's not really new. It's just packaged a bit differently. Everything really goes back to plan, do, check, act, and all of our experiment cycles and the lean change management loopy diagram. It's all based on the same kind of core ideas. But we keep reinventing different practices and processes, but the data is telling us that it doesn't work. So why do we keep trying to invent processes and practices and cute little statements to try and move the needle? Why don't we instead look at the social dynamics of the organization and how change actually happens and use that to our advantage? So even though companies do have barriers, they are still getting some benefits out of it. So it's funny that when we look at on the right side of the diagram, the things that are the most important tend to get better. So we want better alignment, we want to manage our priorities better, and those things get better. But the funny thing is, on the left-hand side, all the things that we don't care about, like team morale, because who cares about the team morale, right? We want to make more money. Who cares about engineering discipline? Technical practices don't really matter. But we sort of get these nasty side effects that are probably the reason why we should be bringing Agile in the first place, is to have good technical practices and to have happy teams and to increase morale and make it easier to manage distributed teams. So companies are getting some types of benefits. If we flip the coin over and we look at what the change management world says, there's a whole bunch of studies that talk about change only works 30% of the time, or the way they flip it around, like I said, change fails 70% of the time. Funny thing is, the companies that you'll see here, guess what they sell? They sell methods and tools and consulting services, and tell you that it'll fail 70% of the time unless you buy my method. But even if you buy my method and use it and your change doesn't work, it's because you didn't use it right. So it's all just kind of backwards consulting, big business nonsense, and it's not really helpful when you're a developer sitting at your desk and you want to figure out how to let your manager or how to convince your manager to let you guys pair program, or how do we get rid of these 300 project artifacts and move to a big sticky note wall. This big change management view and these agile failure modes don't really help when you're kind of in that moment at your desk and you need to act and figure out how to do something. So that's kind of what I'm going to go through today. So, like I said, we want to feel certain that we're headed in the right direction. And a really good test for this is for anybody who walks to work, take a different path to work every day and then see how your brain feels once you get to the office. That will help you understand the idea behind certainty. There's a fellow named David Rock who wrote Your Brain at Work, who talks about certainty is something that we need. Our brains don't understand the difference between a social and a physical threat. So if we don't feel certain about the future that we're headed towards, our brain reacts the same way as if we feel we're walking down a dark alley and we hear footsteps. So it doesn't know the difference. That's why we want our transformations to work according to a project plan. But deep down, we kind of know it doesn't work that way. Here's how it really works. It sort of works in waves. So we start off with some type of transformation where it could be dropped from the hole in the floor in the ceiling that the C-level suite says, thou shalt do agile, drop it through the floor and watch chaos ensue. Or it could be a team or a manager or a tester or a developer. Somebody just is so fed up with the way things are working, they decide to act. And they attend a webinar like this, or they bring a meetup into their office, or they bring in a book for people to read. So some event triggers it. And then usually what organizations do, from what I've seen, they train everybody, they do a pilot, they assign one person to be responsible for the transformation, and they create the rollout plan. And some of them get pretty fancy and they have, well, let's do a little pilot and a small little experimental loop. And then once that works, then we'll make a bigger experiment loop and we'll bring in other teams and stuff like that. It's still very kind of linear and mechanical, even though it looks nice in a diagram. Because after that, that's when the political storm happens. That's where people who stand to gain something from Agile support it and run with it, and people who don't like it dig their heels in. So anyone who works in a medium or larger organization where you've got a big PMO or multiple PMOs, sometimes they can feel threatened with Agile because Agile is not very nice to project managers or PMOs a lot of the times. So instead of working with those people and trying to help them figure out what they can do to make programs run smoother and thin out bureaucracy, we tend to kind of fight against it. And that's what creates that political mess. And then we start blaming everybody. So the Agile folks blame the non-Agile people for not having the right mindset. And the non-Agile people blame the Agile people for running amok and just being crazy and not planning well enough. And then we start to slide down this wave, and then we get into the pit of despair where we fire the coach or the consulting firm. So the rule is, for anybody who is a coach or a consultant on the webinar, don't ever be the first person in there, because nothing you do will work and you'll get all the blame for everything. So I've had this happen before. So it's kind of something where you walk in and say, how many times have you tried this before? Oh, this is your first time? Well, sorry, we're kind of booked for the year. We can't really help you. Yes, that was a bit of a joke, but it still is the pattern. And that's because it takes people in the organization a long time to figure out what Agile really means. And for people who are coaches or consultants on the call, you might have experienced when it is 8 or 9 months later and you hear your client say something you said 8 or 9 months ago, and you just want to grab them by the head and scream in their face. But that's where you know that they have attached meaning and they understand it and they're going to try to make it work now. So we get down to that bottom of the wave, and then we do the same thing all over again. Bring in a new firm with a new method and a new process and retrain all of them. Do another pilot, get a new VP of Agile. But this time, instead of having a Gantt chart for our rollout plan, we change user stories and we use Scrum to create a rollout plan. And then the same thing happens. Same political fights happen over and over again. The blaming process starts all over again, and then that coach or consulting firm or VP of Agile are let go. So when you are an employee in the organization, you can kind of ride the wave. I've been in so many different organizations where, one public or government organization, they've seen every perceived fad come and go since the 70s. And anyone who's worked in government is, people tend to stay there a long time, and they just ride the wave. They just go, well, this CIO, he'll last for a few years and then he'll be gone, and then someone else will come in and will do something different. So we'll just kind of keep our heads down and nod our heads and um, follow along until the next kind of fad comes along. So change never really has a natural starting, middle, and end point. You're always thrown into the middle of a constant changing reality. And a lot of the times as a change person or coach, you have to feel your way through that. You sort of know when the window of opportunity is going to open, where you have a very strong opportunity to influence people who can really make positive change. And that's what we want to look for. We want to look for those social dynamics instead of trying to figure out what is a really good process we can use to follow. So if we look at alternatives to managing a transformation in a linear way, we know they don't follow a project plan, but we still need to worry about budgets and reporting and all that other kind of fun stuff, especially in large organizations. But the actual change isn't going to follow that plan. I've worked in some organizations where at the end of the year, the transformation program has a little green light on its status report. We spent exactly $1.5 million, but nothing is fundamentally different. But when it's reported up through the rankings, it looks like everything worked just fine. So let's kind of separate those things out and just talk about just the change side of it. So change always starts from action. This is true in our social settings. This is true in our organizations. This is true in our families and at home. At some point, someone is either motivated and willing to do something different, or they're just sick and tired of the bullshit and the same old, and they're unwilling to deal with those problems anymore, so they act. There isn't a whole lot of organization around it. So this is where you have people who have different interpretations of Agile sort of running in different directions. You might have different coaches from different consulting firms. You may have people with a development view running one way, the testers running a different way, project managers running a different way. But something is happening. People are acting and they're kind of kicking up dust and disrupting the organization. And if that's all that happens, then you sort of get labeled as the rogue outsider. So I don't know if anyone on the call has felt that they're just sort of the outsider to the organization and no one's really listening. That can happen as well in emergence. But in emergence, there's not a lot of planning. We're sort of feeling our way through and we're trying to poke different areas of the organization to see how it responds. After a while, if we really are serious about making this change work, we start to put a little bit of structure around it. So we get to the point where we feel we need to have a little more organization. So that might be, if anyone on the call has sort of been labeled the unofficial Agile guru. So people will show up at your desk or send you an email and say, well, I hear you're the Agile guru. Can you help me with this Kanban thing or this Scrum thing? That can happen as well. But there's a little more structure, there's a little more organization, there's a little more sense of purpose, and we've learned a little bit about what this change is going to do to our organization, and we start to rally around it. Maybe that is creating book study groups or creating a little community of Agile practitioners. stuff like that. So a little bit more organization. Then we can go too far and we can end up in bureaucratization. So that's where we formalize it. Maybe we go too far in formalizing it. So there's sort of a sense of, especially in lean startup thinking with starting up a company, people who are really good at ideas and acting quickly and gathering feedback, responding, tweaking, changing, being very innovative. They are very good at launching new companies, and then they hit a point where they need somebody who has a different mindset to take it to the next level. I've seen this in small startups that I've worked for too, where the founding member builds and writes the application, does the sales, uh, very charismatic leader, very inspirational, and then they hit a ceiling of how far they can take that company. Then we need somebody who is strong with project management and strong with financial analysis and market analysis and all these kind of MBA boring business things that we don't like to talk about in Agile. Same thing in bureaucratization with the change. Now we need to have someone who can really kickstart this movement and almost institutionalize it in the organization. But you can go too far, which will lead into decline, which is the fourth stage of a social movement. A lot of the times we get successes in our organizations, but we don't realize it. So I worked in one organization where they went from 900 onboarding documents to 300. And it's still a process approach to Agile, but it's a lot better than what it was. We tend to say, well, that's a failure because nobody adopted the Agile mindset. But if we saved $11 million a year in paperwork, that's a pretty substantial success. So we should not overlook that stuff. There's outright failure, so it just didn't work for whatever reason. And I worked in one other large organization where absolutely nothing worked, zero. So it was a combination of things. I probably wasn't the right coach, probably wasn't the right time for this company to be doing stuff in an agile way, and whatever the other reasons were, but none of us could figure it out. Just wasn't the right time. That should be co-optation, not co-option, so I'll fix that. And that's basically where we try to bring this movement in by using the old values of the organization. So if we want to bring in Agile, which is more about values and principles and purpose, but we use sort of the right side of the manifesto as our guide and the way that things normally work around here. So you could call this sterilizing Agile. So we just bring in a bunch of process documents and buy Jira or Rally or something like that and use all the old values in the organization to make this change. So the movement declines and we end up just having a waterfall process stream and an Agile process stream, and we don't fundamentally change anything. Repression is when things just go back to the old way, and then go mainstream is when the new change, it's similar to success, but the new change has sort of been embedded in the culture and you've moved forward. So those four stages, that's how all change works. Doesn't matter if it's in your company or if you don't like something in the city you live in, you go lobby at City Hall and you try to find other people who live in your town that feel the same way. You create a movement, you put some structure and organization around it, and then eventually the rules change at City Hall. It's the same thing in our organizations. We undervalue trying to swim with the political currents and end up just using the Agile stick and whacking people over the head with it and say that they don't have a good enough mindset. A lot of times you might have heard this term from Agile folks before, that we need to embrace uncertainty. But I don't think we need to embrace it. I think we need to figure out how to reduce it. And when we're trying to figure out how to reduce uncertainty, we become more open and more curious to conversations. And that's how transformation works. It doesn't matter what method or approach or tool you choose, you still have to go and talk to people at the end of the day. So we need to figure out what's in it for me, what's in it for you, what's in it for management, what's in it for the PMO, and have those conversations. Otherwise, the people who are passionate about Agile through emergence that start disrupting the rest of the organization, they will get isolated over a period of time. And I've seen too many situations where those people, they get frustrated after a year and they quit. Um, so we need to invite those conversations and try to understand what's important to the people that we need to work with day in and day out. So the way I like to think about it is there's a quote from Benjamin Franklin where he says there's only three types of people in the world. There's those that move, those that are movable, and those that are immovable. And the movers are people like, for any musicians on the webinar, Eddie Van Halen is known as a mover. So his signature sound was created by blowing up lots of amps. They had to change how tablature was written because nobody could figure out what the hell he was playing on guitar. And he inspired a whole generation of guitar players by acting and doing stuff and trying things out. Another a great musician, Richie Kotzen, who's a guitar player, he tells a really good story about he was just so tired of his playing style. It was the same thing over and over again. And one day he just said, "Screw it! I'm going to play this whole show without a pick." And he just played with his fingers, and it completely changed how he wrote songs down the road, and his whole style and his approach and everything. So there's people in our organizations that they latch onto this agile stuff and they run with it, and we need those people to start this movement. Then we've got the people in the middle who are the skeptics, and we'll have positive and negative skeptics, right? We tend to discount the value of having skeptics opposing this agile movement because we need this natural kind of push and push back to make progress. Because the people who are the movables, who are kind of the fence sitters, they bring more of a voice of reason. They can say, yeah, sticky notes on the wall could work, but we are distributed across 8 time zones. So how would that work? Um, they bring value, but they're going to sit there and wait until other people move first. One large organization I worked for, we launched 10 teams that were the movers. So they wanted to do this agile stuff. And they said, just give us all the help you can, we'll do everything. And then we had the group, the next wave of people that they wanted to wait and see how those teams did first. So as the external, the first group of movers, I came in as the coach. The second group, I came in as a trainer and said, here's how the practices work from a technical process perspective. Now let me bring in one of the teams who have been doing this for 6 months, and you guys have a conversation. Because they're the movables, they're not going to listen to the outsider. They're going to listen to people in the organization who've made it work. So anybody who's a coach or a consultant, you may have heard your client say, yeah, it's never going to work here. You just don't know how things work around here. That's sort of how you know you're working with a movable. They need to see evidence that somebody else in their tribe has got this to work. And then there's poor Rarity. Rarity is our change resistor. Rarity is that evil project manager who doesn't want to do this agile stuff. And those are the people resistors. We blame them for everything, and we put all of our energy trying to convince them this way is better. We need to listen to them, but ultimately not ignore what they say, but say, yeah, valid concerns, and go work with the other groups. A really interesting quote is, rising ocean floats all boats. So let's focus on the movers and the movables. And the hardcore resistors are going to opt out anyway. They're going to get frustrated and leave, just like the early adopters. If they don't see the organization is going as fast as they are, they're going to opt out and leave too. So you kind of have all these weird dynamics, and a lot of change models that are linear talk about how we get people aligned to the change and we get buy-in for everything, and then we execute it and we close it down. But every single person in groups and teams are going to be at different levels and different intensities with how they are receiving this change. So there's never going to be a whole team or a whole organization that magically develops the same mindset. Because if they did, then we might as well just let the robots take over. It just doesn't work that way. But it sounds good and it makes us feel good that we're certain about where we're going. So don't forget to ask some questions, because I'm planning on wrapping up in about 10-ish minutes or so, and then we'll leave it open to answer some questions. So I don't see any Whoops, sorry, that was a finger slip. I double swiped the mouse pad. So can everybody still hear me? Yep, my fault. Actually, it's Rarity's fault. Rarity's the immovable, and Rarity's the resistor. So she's the one that's responsible for that. So, like I said, we need to figure out how to reduce the uncertainty, not just blindly embrace it. And the way that we reduce uncertainty is to take action and see what happens. So, some tips based on the four stages of how movements happen. So in emergence, like I said, the people dynamics up at the top there, that's where the movers are disrupting and acting and doing stuff. The movables are sitting on the fence, and then the immovables, they're protesting and lobbying against it. So the approach that we want to take for change here is to not create a perfect plan and not create a balanced scorecard and an agile maturity assessment model and a lot of these things that I see most organizations do. We need to explore and experiment, use fuzzy metrics. One large organization I worked for, the one where I mentioned we had 10 teams that started first, at the end of every month for the first quarter, we did all full team retrospectives. So we would get about 50, 60 people on the phone and 50, 60 people in the room because they were distributed across Canada. And we would ask questions like, does it feel better working this way? Because we're exploring, we're experimenting. We don't know exactly where we're headed. We just want to know if so far, is this a better way of getting work done? Versus, what's your velocity and what's this metric and what's that metric? And are we progressing towards future state? Does everybody understand the urgency for change? All this stuff, it's just not normal the way people talk. People come in, they grab their coffee, they complain about their boss, they go out for beers in the afternoon on a Friday, and we're social creatures. So let's try to leverage how people interact with each other. So we want to be able to live through our existing rituals, and that's things like a lot of companies have their annual planning, their annual budgeting, their quarterly, hirings and firings to meet their financial commitments, all these types of things. And we don't know how Agile is going to affect our organization until we try to get Agile to work while those rituals are happening. We also want to try and understand who are the key influencers and why. How do we swim with the political influence of the organization instead of kicking against it? So we're kind of in exploration mode. So if you think about how any society or city has been founded, there's explorers. There's people that go out there and they try stuff out and they see what happens. We don't put a lot of formality around it, and we don't want to at this point. Once we move into coalescence and we want to start to put a little more structure around things, that's where communities are very important. So the movers who have been kind of little singular entities that have been running off and doing stuff, they start to find like-minded people and they start to create study groups or lean coffee sessions, or they go to meetups, or they invite local agile thinkers in to talk with them. They go to external meetups, stuff like that. They bring in maybe workshops, but they start to build more community, find like-minded people who feel the same that they can learn from. The movables, now some of them will start to be convinced that this is the right thing to do, and they'll join the movement, or they'll still wait, or they'll even opt out. They'll say, you know what, I saw enough evidence to say this totally isn't for me. I don't want this. And the immovables will start to lobby even harder to bring control, because now they see the uprising happening. And maybe that's a little dramatic, but they see these agile people running amok, and that can't happen here. Those people can't do that. I'm responsible for this. So they start to lobby harder against what this movement is. So the approach to change is to put a little more structure in place. Share stories, go visit other companies. Anything, any of the talks or YouTube videos from coaches or consultants who are telling a story about a company, take a lot of those with a grain of salt, because we tell those stories to sell stuff, right? Go find real people in the organization who lived through it. It's pretty easy through Twitter, through Facebook. You can find through LinkedIn. You can find people who work in these companies and talk to them about how it worked. So share those stories. if you're hearing these stories and they're all these rosy, perfect stories about how great everything was, they're bullshit. So find people who have the real story, because that's how the change is going to move forward. The change is going to happen when we share the good, the bad, and the ugly, not when we just show a cool little picture and go, wow, look how awesome our company is because we did this Agile thing. Add minimal structure. So don't create roles and responsibilities and create a whole hierarchy of an Agile, center of excellence, which is what most companies start off with. Have a little bit of structure, a little bit of rituals. Every Friday do pull-based sessions like I would always do lean coffees in organizations, or the doctor is in sessions. So what that means is every Friday at 2 o'clock, bring all of your problems to this Agile council thing. We'll run it lean coffee style. But through that process, you're finding people who are motivated and interested in wanting to use these approaches. And then they're going to help you spread a message. So create some more of those rituals. One thing I really like to do is if I get asked to help a department or a team, instead of adding new meetings and ceremonies to their already busy plate, beg managers to steal the last 15 minutes of their weekly department meeting. So try to reuse some of the existing rituals that happen, and reduce the barrier as much as possible. Because again, separate what coaches and consultants do when they're external. They have to push because they're only there for a limited amount of time. But if you're an employee in the company, you do have a bit more of luxury of time. So you can wait for those windows to open. We want to focus on cause and purpose. Change urgency is a big thing in the change management world. It's starting to leak its way into Agile, where people will say, well, what's the urgency for change? Well, that really depends. If you're the CEO, the urgency might be, holy crap, we're going to be out of money in 6 months. Like, we need to be more efficient. The urgency for the developers might be, our code is a mess and we need better XP practices to get things fixed up. The urgency for project managers might be, man, these projects are always late and I'm always getting yelled at. So it's going to be different. Asking what the urgency for change is just a horrible question to ask. But it's been a cornerstone of change management for so long that it's perceived as a best practice. We really want purpose, because change happens when people believe in what it is, as corny as that might sound. Otherwise, you end up just with superficial change. Temporary structures. We often pile Agile stuff on top of existing processes, and we never take anything away. So we need to have some bridging practices. And that might be things like, yeah, we need to add some training or some lean coffees, or we need to visualize our release management wall, release management work with sticky notes on a wall. But that stuff will go away eventually. That is to shift our based on our cause and purpose. It's to shift the way that we interact with each other. And then once we have status quo, those temporary structures can go away. Tools is a big one in Agile. People say, no, Jira is horrible, you shouldn't use it. Don't start with the tool, but once you have people who are synchronizing work in front of a big visible wall and the behavior is working well, then you can go back to a tool if you need to. But don't jump to a tool right away. So some of those temporary structures are going to take more time, and I'm pretty blunt with most companies to say that, yeah, it is going to be extra work for a little bit, but ideally we're going to be able to get rid of these other 10 structures and processes and meetings and stuff like that after the fact. So I don't see any questions yet, so that's why I'm going a little bit longer in these. So if I do see a question, then there's only a couple more things to get through. Once we get to bureaucratization, now that's where you tend to see, in big companies, that's 12 to 18 months. And that's where the early adopters, the early Agile adopters opt out and leave and go to another company, or they get very defensive and cagey and frustrated and jaded, and they almost become the resistors, because anyone who's seen the Take Agile Back movement or Agile Uprising, there's this feeling that it's been taken over by big business and we need to bring it back. So it creates another kind of strange dynamic that we have to work with in our organizations. The movables will tend to pick a side, so they're either going to go along with the Agile stuff, or sink back to the old way for whatever reason. And now there's almost a shift in power, right? The immovables start to feel that, oh, well, I'm winning this battle. So I'm now getting what I want out of this because this agile stuff is not for me. The approach there for change is to, now we can start to, the emotional response is starting to die down a little bit, and it's starting to become more real to the organization. People are starting to feel what it means to really be an agile organization. Now we can make more of a conscious choice. We have some data, we have some stories, we have small victories we've been celebrating, and now we can decide, where do we want to go as an organization? That might be a year or a year and a half. There's some companies I know, they've been at this for a decade, and they're still evolving. That's the way it works. It doesn't happen in a linear kind of way. Here we need people who are strong organizers. A lot of big companies are doing their own internal conferences now. So they're inviting speakers from all over the world, and they're running their own internal Agile conferences. They have official Agile support groups. They still have some of the Agile governance and project management stuff because big companies need that. But there's more organization around it. There's more structure. There's a different set of values, and they're sort of swimming with the political currents instead of against it. And like I mentioned a little bit earlier, get rid of some of the old meetings and ceremonies and artifacts in favor of the new ones, and then get rid of those temporary structures. So the company I mentioned where we had 10 teams and they were all in retrospectives once a month, that only lasted for a quarter because that served its purpose. So normally what we will say is, oh, well, that didn't work. It only lasted for 3 months. It was a total failure. The in-person lean coffees, we got a lot of people out early on, and then it started to die off a bit. And people say, well, that was a failure. And for me, that's a huge success. That tells you that what you have done has now become embedded in the culture. And that temporary structure is not needed anymore. We tend to think there needs to be finality and sustainable change is what people call it. Sometimes all changes have a shelf life, and they will cease to be valuable after a certain point of time. So tear them down and don't do them, because you're going through a wave, like I mentioned earlier. That's analogous to hitting the bottom of the wave, and then now you need to create different structures to take your change to the next level, versus thinking everything needs to be sustainable. Decline, again, it's take decline with a bit of a grain of salt, because a lot of the times you won, but you didn't realize it. The movers, if we have repressed and gone back to the old way, or we're not using the agile values, we're using different values for our transformation, they will feel like it's a failure. They will become isolated. They might opt out, but it just doesn't feel very good. And you might have experienced this in your organizations. I've seen it in many. I've seen 3 times whole change teams leave within a month because they just get frustrated. They see that it's just become another bureaucratic process, and that's not for them. So they go to another company. The movables kind of sink back into a status quo, and they go back into the wait and see mode. And the immovables feel successful. They got rid of the flies that were buzzing around them, and they got their way, and they got more control, and they got more of a process-oriented approach. So from their perspective, it worked. The thing that we need to do there is celebrate victories. If it doesn't work, just wipe the slate clean. Humans are generally, we love blaming people for stuff. If anything goes wrong, it's everybody else's fault around me. It can't possibly be me. But if I screw up, it's because there's some weird circumstance that, the planets were aligned in a certain way, and, I stepped on a spider that day, and just all these things that it can't possibly be me. We're really good at externalizing blame, and we want to blame the PMO for not supporting it, and we want to blame leadership for not being agile enough. This is where we need to wipe the slate clean and say, you know what, for whatever reason, it didn't work. Let's look at all the reasons why. Let's get all of the dirty laundry out on the table, wipe the slate clean, and then decide if we want to do it again. And most importantly, stop and look around. In Agile, we say a lot of, hey, we need to continuously improve, and we need to be constantly evolving. And it's tiring. It's easy to say if you're a coach and you're only there for 3 months, yeah, we need to continually improve. Well, right, because you only are there for 3 months. Employees who are there for 10 years, if you're continually improving every week, even if it's 1%, it's really tiring. So sometimes enjoy the status quo. Look around, stop, slow down, celebrate the victories, realize nothing is ever going to be perfect, but take a bit of a deep breath and then try again and create the movement again. That is, like I mentioned a couple times, the benefit of being an employee versus being the outsider coach or consultant. Sometimes you have the luxury of time. You can wait and see how the change sort of works itself out. So the whole idea behind rethinking transformation is follow the laws of how change happens versus a rule and a process. Any process diagram that you see that's created, whether it's an agile process or a change process or whatever, it's just someone's view of how they see the world. It's no more true than anything anybody on this webinar could scribble on the back of a napkin. But what really makes change work is when you understand what's in it for you, when you understand what's in it for management, when you understand what senior leadership wants and what your peers want, and you're moving forward the same system of people do. So that's, one of the ideas from the org change course I took was the professor said, if you want to learn what really makes organizations tick, start smoking. Because when you go out to the smoking area, you have the most diverse set of people out there. So that's where you learn the most about an organization, and that's where you can start to establish relationships with people in various different departments and groups and with political influence. And we drastically underestimate the power of how those relationships and how social change actually works. So there are some links here with some additional stories and some tools and things that can help. And I just saw a couple of questions come in, so I'll just go. I'll just start with the first one, I guess.
Yeah, please take them and try to answer as many as you can.
Sure. Measuring transformation. That's the $1,000,000 question. It really depends on a whole bunch of factors. I mean, if you Google Agile assessment or Agile balance scorecard, you'll find a whole bunch of mechanical project management-y things to be able to measure it. People might have seen what Spotify did with their little colored stoplights and trends. So a lot of it was based on feeling. It really depends what you're after. I mean, you tend to get what you measure. So if you want to measure, well, we expect Agile is going to make us more productive. How do you measure productivity? On the extreme end, you could start to measure how fast developers type, because if they type faster, that means I've seen teams measured on how many lines of code they produce. So the best way to measure in emergence when you're just starting, in my personal opinion, is to leave it as fuzzy as possible. Are the people paying for the projects more satisfied? So using Net Promoter Score. Will they recommend their IT delivery team? Do people on teams doing the work, do they feel happier? A really crazy thing that Henry Ford did in the 20s was he started paying people on the line, the car assembly line, $5 an hour, which was ridiculous at the time. But it was contingent on they got $250 an hour guaranteed. The other $250 was if they had a happy life. So they would actually have social committees go visit employees' houses and see how happy their family was. So are employees happier? Are end users more satisfied with the software? Are stakeholders more satisfied? If you start from there, that will help you figure out what's really important. If you go too far into ROI and using velocity and comparing teams and creating these massive scorecards, you're going to get what you measure anyway. So instead of trying to say what's the best way to measure it, for me, it is find out what's important to the organization. So the version 1 reasons, a lot of the times I'll start with companies and I'll ask them, here's the typical reasons why companies are adopting Agile. or why they want to choose it. Why are you using it? And how will you know when it's working? And let them define it. How to prove that we're agile to top management? Hmm, that's a good question. I think it's similar to the last question. So why is it important to prove that you're agile to top management? Why would they care? Start from there would be my recommendation. I mean, otherwise you could start to get into that slippery slope of superficial stuff. I've gone into big organizations where they measure agile by how many people they can cram in a room. Look how collaborative they are. I'm like, that's not collaborative. That's a sweatshop. That's ridiculous. So, again, why is it important? Why do you feel you need to prove that you're agile to top management? Is it top management is saying you guys aren't fast enough, you're not agile enough? Um, what's really underneath the question? We've got about 4 minutes, so I'll go through as many of these as I can. And then, Christoph, if you want to, actually, I can probably copy and paste them. Any ones that I don't get to, I kind of have a habit of just recording a quick 15-minute video to answer them in a bit more depth, and then I'll send you the video. You can send it to the people who registered.
Definitely.
What do you think about frameworks? They serve a purpose in emergence and coalescence, especially in big companies, because they need something to bridge themselves from where they are to where they want to be. And if you just go in with the values and principles, which is personally my view of what you should do, they can't visualize what their 20,000 person organization would look like without a big diagram like that. So I don't tend to think those scaling frameworks are as evil as most agile people. They serve that purpose, but you can go too far with them. How do they help with transformation or make it too formal? If you start off by SAFe even says this, people don't realize it. They say, here's the diagram of all the practices and, like a reference implementation. Pick and choose what is going to make sense in your organization. They don't sell, here, go implement this, but often it's perceived that way. So if we start off a big agile transformation with the SAFe diagram and say, this is the way it's going to be, we have to implement it, that's too formal, because it's just not going to work. You can't jump from nothing to a high level of maturity just by implementing a framework. Cotter's 8 steps. The funny thing is that's now becoming discovered more in agile circles, but generally speaking, the change management world moved on from that over 10 years ago. For them, it's old, it's outdated, it doesn't make any sense. But it looks good, right? Create urgency for change. Okay, great. Create a guiding coalition. Yes. Anchor it in company culture. Yes. Celebrate quick wins. It makes perfect sense when you read it, but it's not relevant in today's world anymore. Jen Fram is one who, she is based in Australia, and she kind of is in the Agile and the change camp as well. And she goes to Agile conferences and sees Agile people talking about Cotter's 8 steps as the greatest thing. And she's like, what the hell? This doesn't make any sense nowadays. So take the good bits of it as a guide. It's a good idea to have some type of urgency, but urgency is a matter of perception. It's good to celebrate quick wins. It's good to have people who are, a guiding coalition, but don't look at it as you go from step 1 to 8 and your change is done, which a lot of people make that mistake. And we could probably do one more.
Question, yeah.
Oh, that's a big one too. How does it force change to the culture and HR processes? Wow, I don't think I can do that justice in a minute, but um, I think it happens. I think more companies nowadays are realizing that transforming to Agile isn't a year-long project anymore. It's a decade, or it's a complete changing of the guard. Um, your culture is going to be shaped by your most influential leaders and influential people in the organization. And sometimes you need to bring in people with a completely different view in a leadership position to start to influence that culture. HR, I think, is becoming more popular now. People are realizing that if we're still incentivizing developers against testers and vice versa, those things need to change. So really depends on, a friend of mine likes to say, what hill are you prepared to die on? So do you really want to deal with the HR, the culture, and all of the other outside of IT issues with Agile, or do you want to wait until they figure it out? Quick story, one organization I worked in where we were moving towards Agile, people were coming to us and asking why they were being sent on waterfall PMI training. So I went to HR and I went to the learning and development people and said, oh, hi, I'm Jason, this Agile coach guy, and we have these alternate training courses for people because we're adopting these new Agile software development practices, and we have some recommendations. So when people come to you guys for training, how do we get these on your list of recommended courses? So I didn't try to fight against the political current. I found who was responsible for it and had a conversation, and ultimately let them pick, because nobody likes someone coming to them and saying you should do this. So it's probably not to do that with HR, because they have access to the levers to pull to really influence the culture. So I'm just going to copy and paste these questions into Notepad, and then probably over the next day or so, maybe sometime tonight, I'll just record a quick video and answer them, and then Christoph, I'll send them to you, and you can send them to the people. But thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason. It was a pleasure. And as I said before, hopefully one day you will come to Poland to our event in person and give a speech and answer some questions. It would be great. And also to all people that don't know, I highly recommend you the book Lean Change Management, and also a podcast Lean Change Management. It's a great piece of knowledge, and I usually listen in the morning when I'm driving to my work. It's kind of espresso for me in the morning. So thank you, Jason, for this.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
it's great. I mean, it's really great. Okay, so thank you, everybody. I also would like to let you know that today we released early tickets for the IT Manager of Tomorrow 2018, and we publish also some speakers. So you can check. I just put it in on your screen, so you can check the website and some speakers, and we'll probably publish some more information in the next couple of weeks. And we also will continue the webinars, so please stay tuned and see you next time. Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks.
Yeah, bye.